All right, hi everybody, and welcome to our final lecture of the week. We're going to just dive in a little bit more structurally into what's going on in the autonomic nervous system and comparing the differences between sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. Here's a list. Some of this will be repetitive from the last lecture. Some of this will be new. Obviously, one of the big differences that I'm not actually going to list here is the norepinephrine versus acetylcholine difference. That's, remember, what's released from the postganglionic fibers towards the effector tissues for, in the case of norepinephrine, the sympathetic branch, and in the case of acetylcholine, the parasympathetic branch. However, these two branches differ in terms of their origin sites. Parasympathetic is found in the craniosacral regions of your central nervous system, so your cranium and basically your tail. And then the sympathetic is found in the thoracolumbar regions of the spinal cord. So you can actually tell whether or not something is parasympathetic or sympathetic based on its positioning in the central nervous system. It's found up here or down at the bottom of the spinal cord. It would be parasympathetic neurons, and the sympathetic ones are found exclusively in the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. They also differ in terms of the relative length of their fibers. This should be a reminder from the last lecture that parasympathetic, for example, has long preganglionic axons and short postganglionic axons. It's the opposite for the sympathetic branch, short preganglionic axons and long postganglionic axons. You can also, in this regard, talk about them in terms of the location of the autonomic ganglia. Parasympathetic ganglia are close or basically on the surface of the visceral effector organs, whereas sympathetic ganglia are close to the spinal cord. A lot of that is highlighted in this picture here. So in blue are our parasympathetic activities, and in green are the sympathetic activities. So you'll notice that the motor neurons for parasympathetic are found up here in the cranial division and down here in the sacral division. And the sympathetic are found in this region of the spinal cord here, which, as I've already said, is the thoracolumbar region. You can also see in this picture the preganglionic axons are long. The autonomic ganglia are close to the effector tissues, and therefore the postganglionic axons are short. If we switch and look at the sympathetic ganglia, you'll see that they are located very, very close to the spinal cord and very far away from the effector tissues. So we have short preganglionic neurons, autonomic ganglia close to the central nervous system, and long postganglionic neurons that project towards the effector tissue. So these should highlight the divisions from differences outlined on the previous slide. But I'll also point out that you'll notice each of these, the parasympathetic and sympathetic, seem to be regulating the same structures. By and large, the same structures. And like I talked about in the previous lecture, is that there's this tug-of-war taking place for all of the control of all your organs between sympathetic and parasympathetic, and it really just depends on what's happening to you and how you feel at any given moment. So here's going through the parasympathetic division. Again, this is located in the craniosacral, or also known as the craniosacral division. So we have a cranial outflow up here, and then we have a sacral outflow down there. So the cranial outflow consists of a few different components. So first of all, we have the oculomotor nerve, innervates smooth muscles of the eye that causes the eyes to bulge and the pupils to constrict. This allows for focusing. Cell bodies of postganglionic neurons are in the ciliary ganglion, which is, again, very, very close proximity to the muscles that are being controlled here. We also have, through the facial nerve, two branches that lead to postganglionic neurons. There's actually a couple ganglia that they're associated with. You don't need to know the names of those. But collectively, these are responsible for controlling crying, mucus production in both the nose and the mouth. 3, we have the glossopharyngeal nerves. These synapse in otic ganglia down here. And they activate the parotid glands, the salivary glands just anterior to the ears. And then finally, the big one when we're talking about parasympathetic cranial nerve number 10, the vagus nerve. Super annoying. Multiple branches, multiple functions. It's a collections of axons bundled into two main plexuses. There are the cardiac and the pulmonary plexuses, so you can tell one's going to the heart and one's going to the lungs. They are responsible for slowing the heart rate and will also serve the lungs and the bronchi. There's celiac plexuses that are responsible for innervating the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas to increase digestive enzyme secretion. So all of the digestive tract is basically regulated by this as well. And so there's lots of nerves that are innervating the large intestine and small intestine, and they're basically just ensuring that all the secretions are working according to plan. Then we consider the sacral outflow. It's broken up into the pelvic splanchnic nerves and the inferior hypogastric plexus. These are responsible for regulating the rectum, the urinary bladder and ureters, as well as the genitalia. This is just a review of what we covered last week in terms of the anatomy of the spinal cord. So I just want to highlight this one location right here. And I've mentioned this a few times, is that there's this little bulge in certain regions of the spinal cord called the lateral gray horn. This is the location of sympathetic neurons. This is a sympathetic motor neuron. In other words, you would only expect to see a lateral gray horn in the thoracolumbar regions of the spinal cord, because those are the only regions of the spinal cord that contain sympathetic motor neurons. If you were in the sacrum, there would be nothing here. If you were in like a cervical region up in the neck, there would be nothing here. It's only in the thoracolumbar regions of the spinal cord do you see the lateral gray horn, and therefore you see the sympathetic motor neurons. The other thing I'd just like to orient yourself here is, of course, there are two roots of the spinal nerve right here. And you know that the anterior root of the spinal nerve is going to be carrying the axons from our autonomic motor neurons in green here. And remember, the two roots come together to form one mixed spinal nerve. And that's kind of what I want to focus on at the moment. So there are branches of the spinal nerve, and I want to focus on a few of them, but I will go through all of them. We have here's our posterior root, here's our anterior root. You can see the ganglion right there, and then here's our spinal nerve. And you see that there are basically three branches to the spinal nerve. There's one which runs posteriorly and serves the back of your body. So it's all this back is being covered. So that's your posterior is covered. We have an anterior branch, which is the big one that covers the front or anterior of your body. And we have these rami communicantes right here, in which there's a small break off. There's a little bit of a ganglion, and then the bundle comes right back and joins the anterior ramus. One of the rami communicans is sending preganglionic axons into the ganglia. The other branch contains the axons of the postganglionic axons and returning them to the anterior ramus. So our postganglionic neuron, or rather our preganglionic neuron, which is right here, I'll actually draw it on this side. Our preganglionic neuron right here is going to come out through the anterior root into the spinal nerve, and then it will either go run this way into the posterior, run this way into the anterior, or feed into this ganglion here where it will synapse with the postganglionic neuron. The postganglionic neuron's axon comes back and then can go out through these branches. The sympathetic division is a little more complex than the parasympathetic division, largely because it innervates more organs. All preganglionic fibers arise from cell bodies of preganglionic neurons in the spinal cord segments T1 through L2. That's why it's called the thoracolumbar division. If you recall your spinal cord anatomy, the cell bodies are in the lateral gray horns. I just showed you that a second ago. And their lateral gray horns, as I said, are only found in this region of the spinal cord. Okay, so we have, just to orient yourselves, here's your spinal cord here. These large things are the vertebrae surrounding it. You can see some ribs. Here's your dorsal root, because you can see the ganglia. Here's your anterior root, which is going to carry our motor information out. So basically what you're going to end up getting is after leaving the spinal cord through this ventral root or anterior root, the fibers are going to pass through rami communicans, which is in white here, feed into this ganglia, synapse with a postganglionic neuron. This is called the sympathetic trunk ganglion. And the axon will then go back into the anterior ramus. And this happens all the way along the spinal cord. So for each layer division of the spinal cord, you're going to have one corresponding trunk ganglion in which all the preganglionic neurons from that level are synapsing with the postganglionic neurons at that level. So again, just to sort of continue on with this, once a preganglionic axon reaches a trunk ganglion, there are three possibilities for what can happen with that axon. One, it can synapse with a postganglionic neuron at the same sympathetic trunk. That's the simplest move. So just to follow us, we know this is the lateral gray horn, so that's your autonomic motor neuron. There's its axon traveling through the anterior root. It's now in the spinal nerve. And it's going to go into the spinal nerve, up the rami communicans, into the sympathetic trunk ganglion where it synapses with the postganglionic neuron. And then the postganglionic neuron just goes out through the same spinal nerve to the effector tissue. Secondly, another option, so we follow again, here's our preganglionic neuron. Axon goes through the anterior root, goes through the rami communicans, but instead of synapsing at that level of the rami communicans, it travels up to the previous level, rami communicans, synapse with the postganglionic neuron there, and then the axon goes out to the effector in that way. The third possibility is that it can pass through the trunk ganglion and emerge from the sympathetic trunk without synapsing. So in this case, it will travel through a splanchnic nerve to reach a distant collateral ganglion where it synapses. This splanchnic nerve is that thoracic splanchnic nerve I showed you a few slides ago that is running along the anterior surface of the spinal column. So again, just to focus on this, lateral gray horn of the spinal cord, there's our autonomic motor neuron. Its axon, that's preganglionic fiber, travels up the rami communicans, but instead of going back out this way or going up to the next level, it passes right through the trunk ganglion and instead goes into this collateral ganglion here where now it synapses with the postganglionic neuron, and then in this case it synapses with the effector tissue in the digestive tract. Okay, so let's break this down. When we talk about the sympathetic division, we have several pathways to the head. These are emerging from T1 through T2, T3, and T4 regions of the spinal cord, the thoracic regions. These are the pathways to the head. They ascend to the most superior region of the sympathetic trunk, which is called the superior, which is called the superior cervical ganglia, right here. There they can control the skin, blood vessels of the head, dilation states of the eyes, the inhibition of salivary glands, which is why you get mouth dryness when you're in a sympathetic mode. And they also contribute to speeding up the heart. So what you're seeing is the preganglionic neurons are sending their axons up into this region. We don't have cranial nerves to deal with when we're talking about the sympathetic division because the sympathetic division's neurons aren't located in the brain. They're instead located in the thoracolumbar regions down here. There are also pathways that emerge from the thorax, so down here, which emerge from T1 through T6. These synapse in the middle cervical ganglia over here, the inferior cervical ganglia down here, or simply the trunk ganglia at their level, so corresponding to each level. Or they can actually take the descent route as well. Collectively, these all combine into what are called the cardiac and pulmonary plexuses. And collectively, these are going to increase your heart rate and increase your breathing rate. And they do the breathing rate by dilating the bronchi and the bronchioles. The majority of the remainder of the preganglionic sympathetic axons end up leaving the trunk without synapsing and choose that third route where they travel to the collateral ganglia through the splanchnic nerves. And the splanchnic nerves, which are shown here, consist of three different types. the greater splanchnic nerve, the lesser splanchnic nerve, the lumbar splanchnic nerve, and the sacral splanchnic nerve. It's really hard to say that over and over again. It should be noted that the sacral, this one down here, this sacral splanchnic nerve contains only postganglionic fibers, and they are responsible for innervating the genital and urinary systems. The preganglionic axons from the other splanchnic nerves lead into the celiac ganglion, the superior mesenteric ganglion, and the inferior mesenteric ganglion, which are all highlighted in these large ganglia here in yellow. The effects of this will always be the opposite of the parasympathetic division. So collectively, they will function to decrease the digestion that is going on. It will slow down the immune system. It will make you forget about peeing and get you sexually aroused to some degree. Finally, as we mentioned in the previous lecture, these neurons are also activating the adrenal medulla, those chromaffin cells, which is responsible for releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine, not as neurotransmitters, but instead as hormones in the bloodstream through the adrenal medulla. We actually have visceral reflexes. The beauty of this is that it's exactly the same as a somatic reflex arc. The difference is, what do we mean by sensing our viscera? Well, first of all, what is viscera? Viscera is just your internal organs. And what should we be sensing in our internal organs? Well, things like stretch, like how full the organ is. Maybe you're measuring certain chemical changes, like the levels of protons. Or the organ has just been irritated for some reason. Maybe there's a virus or there's been some sort of damage that has been incurred. The key point I want to make here is that the sensation takes place via cells in the dorsal root ganglia, which is exactly where they're sensed in the surface regions of our body. The motor output travels through the same ventral nerve and anterior rami as what we sense for the surface regions of our body. So it almost corresponds level to level. So these visceral reflexes are going to, again, obviously start with a stimulus. There's going to be a sensory receptor in the viscera, that's this right here, carries its information into the lateral gray horn, synapses in an integration center with a preganglionic neuron, and that will start the efferent pathway. And then you see the motor axon of the preganglionic cell going into the rami communicans and synapsing at the autonomic ganglia with this postganglionic fiber, and the postganglionic fiber will, in an efferent way, go out through the anterior ramus and synapse with the visceral effector, which will give you, ultimately, your response. Okay, that is the last thing I want to cover for this week. And as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. If there's something you'd like me to cover in the objectives on a video, I'm happy to do that. Please give me that information, and I will be able to accommodate. All right, so happy studying, and I'll see you very soon.